There is something profoundly contradictory about the empath, and I want you to sit with that contradiction for a moment, because it is the very thing that makes them so difficult to understand and so difficult to reach. We tend to think of empathy as a bridge, a way of connecting, and in many ways it is. But what happens when the bridge itself becomes overwhelmed by the weight of everything crossing it? What happens when feeling deeply doesn't bring you closer to people? It actually drives you further away. This is the central paradox of the highly unreachable empath. They are, by nature, among the most emotionally attuned individuals you will ever encounter. They walk into a room and they know things. They sense the tension between two people who haven't spoken it aloud. They feel the grief sitting behind someone's polite smile. They absorb, without trying, without asking, without consent, the emotional reality of everyone around them. And this is not metaphor. This is not poetic language. Neurologically, we understand that certain individuals have a hyperactive mirror neuron system, the brain's mechanism for simulating the internal states of others. For these people, your pain does not stay yours. It becomes shared. It becomes theirs. Now, here is where the paradox begins to deepen, because you would think, logically, that someone with this extraordinary capacity for emotional attunement would be the most connected person in any given space, that they would be surrounded by intimacy, by closeness, by belonging. And yet, the opposite is often true. The most feeling people are frequently the most alone. The most perceptive are often the most withdrawn. The ones who understand others most clearly are the ones who have made a quiet, private decision to keep their distance. Why? Because connection, for the unreachable empath, is not a simple pleasure. It is a cost. Every genuine interaction carries an emotional price tag they cannot stop paying. And over time, through childhood, through relationships, through accumulated experiences of feeling everything while being understood by almost no one, they learn something. They learn that closeness is dangerous, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, exhausting sense that proximity to others means an inevitable loss of self, that to be near someone is to slowly become flooded by them. Dr. Gabor, in his work on trauma and the body, makes a distinction that I find essential here. He speaks of the difference between connection and attachment, noting that many people who appear avoidant or unreachable are not actually rejecting intimacy. They are protecting it. They are keeping it sacred because somewhere along the way, they learned that when they opened fully, they were depleted fully. When they gave access, they lost boundaries. When they loved, they dissolved. And so the unreachable empath builds distance, not from coldness, but from an almost architectural intelligence, a self-designed system for surviving a world that constantly asks more from them than they were ever taught to manage. The withdrawal is not rejection. The silence is not indifference. The emotional unavailability is, in fact, a direct consequence of emotional hypersensitivity. This is the first thing I need you to understand, and I need you to hold it as we move through everything else we're going to talk about today. The people who seem the hardest to reach are often the ones who have already felt too much. Now, I want to challenge something, because there is a label that gets attached to these individuals with remarkable consistency, and it is almost always wrong. Or rather, it is not wrong in its observation, but it is fundamentally wrong in its interpretation. The label is introvert, and sometimes, secondarily, distant, cold, difficult, hard to read. The kind of person others describe at dinner parties with a slight tilt of the head in the phrase, "They're just very private." As though privacy explains everything. As though choosing quiet is simply a personality preference, like favoring tea over coffee. But what if it isn't a preference? What if what we are calling introversion, what we are calling social withdrawal or aloofness, or the need for excessive alone time, is not a character trait at all, but a physiological response? What if the body has already made the decision before the mind has had a chance to rationalize it? This is what I mean when I talk about overstimulation. And I want to be precise here, because the word gets used loosely in popular culture in ways that strip it of its clinical and psychological weight. We are not talking about simply feeling tired after a party. We are talking about a nervous system that is, in a very literal sense, running hotter than most. A system that is processing not just its own internal signals, but the emotional signals of every person in proximity, absorbing tone, micro-expression, energetic shift, unspoken tension, and attempting to metabolize all of it simultaneously. The autonomic nervous system, particularly in individuals with high sensitivity or early developed trauma responses, does not distinguish cleanly between emotional threat and physical threat. It responds to a room full of conflict the same way it might respond to physical danger. Cortisol rises. The nervous system moves toward activation, and the body, in its extraordinary wisdom, begins looking for an exit. Not necessarily a physical exit, though sometimes that too, but a psychological one. A way to reduce input, to turn down the volume on a world that never seems to stop broadcasting directly into them. What looks like introversion is, in many cases, a fawn or freeze response that has been so normalized, so consistently practiced from such an early age, that it no longer feels like a response at all. It feels like personality. It feels like just who I am. And that is one of the most important distinctions I want to make today. The difference between who you are and what you have learned to do in order to survive who you are. Because here is the thing about the highly unreachable empath that rarely gets named. They are not withdrawing from life. They are withdrawing from overload. They are not uninterested in people. They are exhausted by the volume of information people involuntarily transmit to them. Every social interaction is not just a conversation. It is a full-body experience of processing, absorbing, interpreting, and managing emotional data that most people around them cannot even perceive. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive persons identified that roughly 15 to 20% of the population carries this trait, a nervous system wired for deeper processing of sensory and emotional information. And what her decades of research consistently found is that these individuals are not broken. They are not damaged. They are, in fact, exquisitely calibrated. But calibration without understanding becomes burden. Sensitivity without language becomes isolation. And so they go quiet. They cancel plans. They sit at the edges of rooms. And everyone assumes they are simply shy. So we have established that the unreachable empath feels everything, and that the nervous system, in its relentless intelligence, begins to seek shelter from that feeling. But I want to go one layer deeper now, because there is something that develops on top of the overstimulation, something that gets constructed over years, sometimes decades, that is far more deliberate than a nervous system response. Far more architectural, far more chosen, even if the choice was never fully conscious. It is the decision to need no one. And I want you to hear how that sounds when I say it plainly like that, because I think most people in this room will recognize it immediately, either in themselves or in someone they have loved and never quite been able to reach. The radical self-sufficiency, the quiet but immovable insistence on handling everything alone, the almost reflexive deflection when someone offers help, genuine care, or emotional support. The person who will drive themselves to the hospital before they will ask someone to take them. The person who researches, prepares, and executes entirely independently, not because they are arrogant, but because somewhere in their history, depending on someone cost them something they could not afford to lose again. This is what I call the hyper-independence armor, and it is one of the most misread traits of the highly unreachable empath, because from the outside, it looks like confidence. It looks like capability. It looks, frankly, impressive. The person who never seems to struggle, who always manages, who appears to have everything quietly, competently under control, and the world tends to reward them for this, to admire it, to lean on it, even. But here is what the world does not see. It does not see what happened before the armor was built. What typically precedes hyper-independence in the empath is a history, not always dramatic, not always what we might clinically identify as trauma in the capital T sense, but a history of emotional labor that was never reciprocated, of giving care without receiving it, of being the person everyone came to and having no one come to them, of opening themselves fully in relationship and being either dismissed, overwhelmed, or quietly consumed by someone who mistook their sensitivity for an unlimited resource. And over time, the empath makes a calculation. Not a logical one, not a deliberate one, but a deeply embodied one. The calculation is this: if I need nothing, I risk nothing. If I depend on no one can fail me. If I become entirely self-contained, I remain entirely safe. Mate speaks often about how the strategies we develop in childhood to cope with emotional environments that exceed our capacity do not disappear when we become adults. They graduate. They become personality structures. They become the stories we tell about who we are. And hyperindependence is one of the most sophisticated graduation ceremonies of the wounded empath, because it takes what was originally a pain response and transforms it into an identity. I am just someone who handles things alone. I don't really need much from other people. I've always been this way. But always is rarely true. There was a before. There was a child, or a younger self, or a version of this person who wanted to be held, who wanted to be seen, who reached and was not met, and who eventually, quietly, stopped reaching. Not because the need disappeared, but because the hope did. And that distinction matters enormously, because you cannot heal a wound you have renamed a personality trait. There is a cycle I want to describe to you now, and I want to describe it carefully, because I suspect that for many of you, hearing it named out loud will feel like something long overdue. It is a cycle that operates largely beneath the level of conscious awareness. It is quiet, it is relentless, and it is one of the most exhausting things a human nervous system can sustain over a lifetime. It begins with giving. Not ordinary giving, not the casual generosity of someone who helps when it is convenient. The empath gives from a place of compulsion, because they feel what others feel, because they cannot easily distinguish between someone else's pain and their own, because standing in the presence of another person's suffering and doing nothing feels, to them, like a moral failure of the highest order. And so they give, they show up, they absorb, they carry. They counsel at midnight and comfort at inconvenient hours and hold space for people who have never once thought to hold it back. They give, in many cases, far beyond what is sustainable, because the alternative, to them, does not feel like self-preservation. It feels like abandonment. And then, inevitably, they collapse. Not dramatically, usually. The unreachable empath rarely collapses in ways that are visible or legible to others. It is more of an internal shutdown. A sudden and complete inability to continue. A wall that comes down without warning, not just between them and the people they have been pouring into, but between them and the world entirely. They go silent. They withdraw. They become, for a period of time, entirely unreachable in the most literal sense. And from the outside, this looks like disappearance. It looks like coldness, inconsistency, even cruelty, particularly to the people who had come to depend on their presence. But here is where the cycle takes its most punishing turn, because the empath, even in their withdrawal, even in the depths of their depletion, does not stop feeling. They feel the confusion of the people they have gone quiet on. They feel the disappointment, the abandonment, the unmet need. And because their entire system is wired to respond to exactly these emotions, the withdrawal becomes unbearable in its own way. The guilt moves in immediately. Heavy, specific, personal guilt. Not the vague guilt of someone who has made a social misstep, but the acute guilt of someone who believes, at a foundational level, that they are responsible for the emotional well-being of others, that their absence is a form of harm, that in protecting themselves, they have somehow committed a wrong. And so they return, they reemerge, they begin again, they give again, often with even more intensity, as though trying to compensate for the retreat, to make up for the silence, to prove that they are still reliable, still present, still worthy of being needed, until the next collapse, until the next wall, until the cycle completes itself once more. What we are describing here is not a character flaw. It is not inconsistency for its own sake. It is, as Mate would frame it, a trauma response masquerading as a relational pattern. It is what happens when a person has learned, deeply, bodily, pre-verbally, that their value is contingent on their usefulness. That love is something you earn through service rather than something you receive through simply being. That rest is selfish. Boundaries are betrayal. And the moment you stop giving, you become expendable. This belief does not arrive in adulthood. It was installed long before. And until it is examined, truly examined, not just intellectually acknowledged, the cycle will continue. Because guilt is an extraordinary motivator, but it is a terrible compass. I want to take you somewhere specific for a moment. I want you to think about the last time you walked into a room, a party, an office, a family gathering, a space you had never been in before, and felt something shift inside you before a single word had been exchanged, before you had spoken to anyone, before you had assessed the situation consciously. Something in you had already registered. A heaviness, a tension, a residue of something that happened there before you arrived. Or perhaps the opposite, an inexplicable lightness, an ease that seemed to have nothing to do with the physical space itself. Most people, when this happens, shake it off. They attribute it to mood, to hunger, to the quality of light in the room. They move on. The unreachable empath cannot move on, because what they experienced was not a mood. It was data. This is what distinguishes the highly sensitive empath from the simply compassionate person, and it is a distinction that matters enormously for understanding why these individuals find the world so relentlessly difficult to inhabit. The compassionate person responds to what they are told. They hear someone is suffering, and they feel moved to respond. That is beautiful. That is human. But the empath does not wait to be told. They receive information through channels that most people do not even recognize as channels. They read rooms the way others read text, fluently, involuntarily, and with a comprehension that carries real physiological weight. And it is not limited to individual people. This is the piece that rarely gets discussed, and I think it is one of the most important. We talk about empaths absorbing the emotions of individuals, the grieving friend, the anxious colleague, the partner who says they are fine while radiating everything but. But what about the collective emotional atmosphere? What about the accumulated feeling of a space that has held decades of unspoken conflict? What about the energy of a crowd moving towards something? Excitement, anger, grief, that hasn't yet found its language. Research in social neuroscience increasingly supports what many highly sensitive individuals have reported for their entire lives, that human beings are continuously transmitting and receiving emotional information below the threshold of conscious awareness. Through subtle shifts in posture, vocal tone, facial microexpression, autonomic signals that we cannot fully suppress no matter how composed we believe ourselves to be. The mirror neuron system we discussed earlier does not require direct interaction to activate. Proximity alone can be sufficient. And for the empath, whose system is already running at heightened sensitivity, a room full of people is not a social opportunity. It is a symphony of unfiltered transmission, and they are receiving every frequency simultaneously. This is why they leave early. This is why they need hours alone after gatherings that others found effortless. This is why certain homes feel inhabitable to them and others feel impossible. Why specific cities carry specific emotional textures they cannot explain rationally. Why they will sometimes refuse to enter a space and be unable to articulate why beyond a feeling, a knowing, that something in that space will cost them more than they currently have to spend. And none of this is mysticism. I want to be clear about that. This is not a conversation about metaphysics. This is a conversation about a nervous system that was built or shaped through experience to receive more than the average human nervous system was designed to process. The sensitivity is real. The absorption is real. The cost is real. What is not real, or rather, what was never true, is the idea that this makes them fragile. It makes them porous. And there is a profound difference between the two. Here is the expanded segment for key point 6. So here we are, and I want to speak to you directly now, not as a collective, not as an audience, but as individuals, because everything we have covered today has been building toward this single, essential question: what do you do with all of this? You have heard the paradox of deep feeling and deliberate distance. You have heard about the nervous system that runs hotter than most, the armor of hyper-independence, the guilt loop that masquerades as devotion, the capacity to inherit the emotional atmosphere of entire rooms. And perhaps, sitting with all of that, something in you has been quietly nodding. Not the polite nod of intellectual agreement, but the slower, more private nod of recognition. The one that happens in the chest before it reaches the face. If that is you, I want you to stay with that recognition for a moment. Because recognition is not the same as diagnosis. And it is certainly not the same as defeat. Let me offer you something more useful than a label. Let me offer you a framework. Because the question of whether you are a highly unreachable empath is far less important than the question of what you have been doing with that sensitivity and whether it has been working for you. Ask yourself this. Do you find yourself consistently exhausted by interactions that others seem to move through with ease? Do you cycle between intense presence and complete withdrawal and feel guilty for both? Do you carry the emotional weight of rooms, relationships, and histories that do not belong to you? Do you find it genuinely difficult to locate where your feelings end and someone else's begin? If the honest answer to those questions is yes, then we are not talking about personality quirks. We are talking about an unmanaged gift operating without a container. And that word, container, is the one I want to leave with you. Because mate's work, and the work of attachment theorists, trauma researchers, and developmental psychologists who have dedicated their lives to understanding the sensitive nervous system, converges on a single truth. Sensitivity without structure becomes suffering. The capacity to feel deeply is not the problem. The absence of a framework for metabolizing that feeling, that is where the suffering lives. What does that framework look like in practice? It looks like learning to distinguish between empathy and absorption, between choosing to be present with someone's pain and involuntarily becoming it. It looks like recognizing that a boundary is not a wall. It is not the hyper-independence armor we discussed earlier, which is built from fear. A boundary, a real one, is built from self-knowledge. It says, I know what I can hold, and I know what belongs to me, and I am choosing to protect both, not because I do not care, but precisely because I do. It looks like understanding that your withdrawal is not your worst quality. It is your most honest signal. The shutdown, the silence, the disappearance, these are not failures of character. They are a nervous system communicating in the only language it was given. Your work, going forward, is not to eliminate these responses. It is to develop enough internal literacy to hear what they are saying before they are forced to shout. Because here is what I most want you to understand, and what I most want you to carry with you beyond this room. Being an unreachable empath is not a life sentence. It is a starting point. It is the map showing you where you are. And maps, by their very nature, exist to show you where you can go. You were never too sensitive for this world. The world was simply never taught how to be sensitive enough for you.